Before introducing our amazing panel, I just wanted to give a big shout out to Wei Ming. He's the co-chair with me of the APEC Digital Working Group, a really strong collaborator, and to SQ Tech. We are so excited about the white paper that was just released. We've gone through it in depth. That and the new Digital Trust Center of Excellence is going to be a game changer for the work that we're doing at APEC and enabling the evolution of our digital economy and with speed and with acceleration. So I just wanted to give a big shout out to everyone at SQ Tech who's been part of that. What I'm going to do, let me introduce the panel, and then I'm going to provide some context for what we're going to talk about. I'll start with Royce. Royce is Director and Head of Public Policy at Alibaba Group. He was the project lead at SQ Tech for the white paper, so thank you very much. Get some sleep tonight now that it's hit the press. That's great. I'm sure you all know him in the room. Prior to being with Alibaba, he was Director of Economic Regulation at the Ministry of Communications. Ken Wai also is somebody, I've been hanging out with these three gentlemen for the last 48 hours as we've been talking about the white paper. So Ken Wai, Senior Advisor, former CEO of CrimsonLogic, where he focuses on sustaining growth and leading the business team. Prior to CrimsonLogic, he was Microsoft's VP for Public Sector, responsible for business with government and government organizations across Asia. And he preceded me as the APEC Digital Working Group. So we've been comparing notes on what it's going to take to move it forward. And Zikan, Assistant Chief Executive, Data Innovation Protection. He oversees all of IMDA's AI and data industry development strategy and oversees the administration and implementation of Singapore's Personal Data Protection Act, which, by the way, if you qualify for that, you also qualify for CBPR certification, I understand. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Look, before we jump into the discussions, just some context setting. According to PwC, in the world of digital trade, technology is the enabler, but trust is the clincher. And our conversation is one that's relevant for any business seeking to grow and participate in the global digital economy. And knowing your marketplace well, that's pretty much every business in Singapore. You folks are a global powerhouse. We also have to consider where we are. A lot of talk on stage today about, 2.5 years of COVID. Well, we all know what happened through COVID. It was a huge accelerant for the digital economy. MISMEs, supply chains, even our scientific community, we're sharing data like never before. And that had tremendous benefits, particularly for our MISMEs, because it meant they could still operate. But with the benefits of that movement to digital came incredible amounts of risks. Because folks, the framework and the infrastructure just isn't there yet. And that's a big part of what we're going to talk about. The other thing we focus on at APEC, in addition to the conditions for the digital economy, are the trade agreements and the protections in place. It's a digital noodle bowl of regulations, of trade agreements that are overlapping, conflicting, and sometimes entirely silent. So if we're going to maximize the benefits and minimize the risks across such a complex landscape, we really need a modern, standardized policy framework that engenders trust. And that's why the white paper that's just been released is such a thought-provoking starting point, and that's where we're going to dive into our discussion. So, as the project lead, Royce, let's start with you. Give us a quick synopsis on key parts of the white paper and how that links to our conversation today on cross-border data flows.
Sure, thanks, Jen. So the white paper has been released publicly since last week. So I encourage everyone to spend some time to download it, go through it. It's very much an attempt to come up with a conceptual framework in terms of what digital trust means, how do we define it, as well as what are some of the enabling factors for digital trust, conversely, the challenges to digital trust, and what sort of suite of solutions, mitigating measures we need to put in place to mitigate, if not overcome, those challenges. The other facet, I would say, or objective is really to provide a common language that all of us who are invested in this issue of digital trust, and I'll count everyone in this room to be investee, so to speak, in this matter, to start coming together, to start discussing, to collaborating, and to co-create some of these solutions to not just identify and agree in terms of the risks, such as cybersecurity breaches, privacy breaches, AI ethics issues like that, but also some of the opportunities that can come up. What sort of tech solutions we can come up with, what sort of governance solutions, what sort of policies we need to wrap around some of these new technologies. So it doesn't pretend to have all the answers, right? But it minimally tries to solve those two problems, having the conceptual frame and providing the common language, so that at least we can all come together and to have the informed discussion. And it correlates very closely with this topic at hand, because one of the objectives also of the paper is in furtherance of Singapore's goal to be a core part of the digital and data node, right, in the digital economy. I think all of us will be firm believers in the promises of digitalization. Even in the midst of COVID, I think digitalization has really provided a lifeline to a lot of people. SMEs, they have got to pivot online, to deliver the products online. Consumers as well, right? In terms of us all having to order our food, having lessons delivered online, to be able to work online as well. And the very nature of digitalization, or rather for digitalization to meet its full potential, we have to ensure that the different digital ecosystem, tech ecosystems are able to interoperate. And that's where this idea of digital node becomes so powerful. So even as Singapore seeks to be that one of the nodes, the question then is, who are the other digital and data nodes around the world, right? Who are these other tech ecosystems that are important? And how can we ensure that in the midst of all the challenges in terms of localizations or even the overlay of geopolitical risks and concerns, we can still ensure that these economies are able to talk to each other. We can still trade with each other, exchange ideas with each other. So I think with the white paper, I'm very excited that it's really start of this journey to really, as an open clarion call to all of us, to really come together, to really start having that conversation and see how we can advance the discourse.
Thanks for that. Ken, why? There's tension. There's tension between balancing consumer data privacy and data needs for businesses to operate. How should we better engage with regulators to address this?
Talk to them.
And
I mean, when I looked at the question, she prepped me with the question. It took me a long time to figure out what do I say about that. Because when you think about data, there's this fixation with personal data. There's company-sensitive data. There is commercial data. And you got to think about what you use the data for. Businesses and personal data, if you're in a legitimate business, you're not going to do anything wrong with that. But personal data with buying habits, you can do something else. And one of the things that struck me is this term that they say, data is the new oil. When you use that term, it tends to mean that it's an asset you keep, an asset you hoard, asset you mine. So with people like Alibaba, that's great, they got a lot of oil. But what about the other people who need to share that oil? And I think data value comes when you share it openly. So how do you do that? And that's where the tension between, I think, private sector and the government must come in. Because when you think about the government, the private sector, many organizations, I would argue, that don't even have a data governance framework within their organization. They don't know what to do. They don't know what they can share, what they can't share. And then when you look at it from the government point of view, they are very concerned with protecting personal data, but there's a lot of data the government has that they still keep it very restricted. So for example, today in the industry, I am in trade, we help trade flows. Trade data in Singapore is secret. You can't get hold of it. So you don't really know the details only at macro levels. So it's how do you then strike a balance which you can then let people understand and feel that I can use the data in a responsible way, I will share it responsibly, and there are ways whereby I can be accountable for my actions when I use it.
King, what is business getting wrong in its current approach?
Well, I wouldn't say that business is getting anything wrong, but I think that it really starts from the viewpoint of how are you looking at data, right? And here I think I want to speak on an expanded scope beyond just personal data, because I think that the starting points for businesses must be that the realization that there is value in data. If we speak to the CEOs, the board, right, if they understand that there's value in data, then three things come very naturally. The first thing is that businessmen understand value. If they know that there's value in data, they will continue to invest in it to make sure that the quality is good. But they will also want to make sure that it is secured, right? Because they want to preserve that value. The next thing that follows very soon after that is then they will realize that how do I then extract value from it? They will then make sure that there are there are the right people who are empowered, trained to know how to use the data, use it responsibly, right? And then what follows next after that is that very naturally, right, they will make sure that the processes will be in place to make sure that the data is used well, they can extract value, they can preserve value, and they will also make sure that when using the data, they will not do it in a way that would jeopardize the whole business proposition, the whole business model. So I think that I wouldn't say that businesses are getting it wrong, but actually realizing, right, that there's value and taking this methodical approach, right, will enable us to get started. Now, a lot of the regulations that's around personal data is intended to shape behavior. And one of the key things that personal data protection regulation is out to achieve is to actually encourage this accountability over the data that I've just outlined. Because what data protection regulation tries to do is to get this awareness. And if you look into the core substance, right, of what data protection law is about, it's really getting that governance structure in place, getting that realization that you need to protect, but also building in the ability to use data for legitimate purposes and to also protect consumers' personal data.
Well, let's continue on this because the theme that we're talking about today is frictionless cross-border data flows. Is the cross-border certification process broken? We had some great discussions yesterday about CBPR, the cross-border privacy regulations. Why is that proving so difficult to get businesses and regulators to embrace it?
Well, I think before I touch on cross-border data flow as a topic, right, I think I want to pick up points that Ken Wai spoke about. I agree with him. Data is not a consumable, right? It's not oil. Oil you consume once, that's it, right? Data is non-rivalrous, right? So it is possible to be used and reused, and it is the circulation of data that allows more to benefit from it. Circulation can happen domestically. Circulation can happen across borders. So when you're circulating data domestically, particularly in areas of data that's regulated, like personal data, you don't have to think too much about it, because if I've got data and I comply with the Data Protection Act and I'm able to share it with Royce, right? He receives it in Singapore, the Data Protection Act applies to him as well. That framework is there. But when we are transferring data across borders, right, that's where this concept of accountability and responsibility comes back in, right? How do I ensure, right, that when I'm passing it over to Ken Wai, for example, who was operating in a different country, right? How am I to be able to ensure that Ken Wai will be able to handle the data responsibly as well, secure it and protect it? And it is to address these kind of problems, right, that the area of cross-border data flows and regulation of cross-border data flows comes in, to put in place a framework that allows that to happen. In this part of the world, the framework that we are able to participate in is the APEC, right, cross-border privacy rules. And that's something that's designed within APEC for the Asia Pacific. And recently, there has been developments to expand APEC CBPR to global CBPR. And I think that it's the right move, because in the digital economy, your markets and your business opportunities are not confined by geographical regions. So moving APEC to global is the right move, right? And so I think that I just want to maybe just end off here by saying that with a framework like CBPR, it helps to ensure that when I am circulating and sharing data with a recipient who is outside of my country, the recipients will also will be able to provide me with the assurance that he will be able to handle the data to the same level of security and protection. And that way, I can also be accountable to my shareholders, my board, and also to my customers.
Thanks for that. Royce, let's continue on this global CBPR. Is that going to be the key to frictionless digital trade? Is that going to solve the low adoption rate by businesses and the low sign-up by regulators?
I do think there's a lot of potential in the global CBPR. I agree with Zikin that moving from APEC into a global CBPR is a positive move. I think Alibaba certainly supports that. So we are one of the organizations that has obtained the APEC CBPR certification already. So we wait for the growth, right, with bated breath. So it is a suitable tool, I think, and one core reason of that is something that I think Zikin touched upon already, which is the focus on accountability, right? And I tie that back again to the digital trust study or the white paper that we issued. And one core component of that digital trust is how do I demonstrate the accountability, right? Not just in terms of something which I aver myself, but something that has been demonstrated, proven through our systems, our processes, the tech tools that we adopt, the kind of impact analysis that we've carried out. And again, not just in terms of me proclaiming how secure I am, but having this set of systems, processes, policies to be vetted, right? And to be audited by another third-party agent that is objective, that is independent, that is neutral. So I think there's a lot of value in that, and that contributes tremendously to being able to build trust with stakeholders, not just with regulators, but also ultimately with the other companies in the supply chain that we work with, the SMEs who sell on our platform, for example, the data processors who work with us, for example, as well as ultimately the consumers, the men and women in the street, to the extent that they see that our businesses have that trust mark, so to speak. I think it's a great way to not just open conversations, but also to then build the level of trust, the level of comfort, the level of confidence and assurance that we're secure, that we're trusted, that we use data for appropriate purposes, for transparent purposes, to the extent that we need consent, we have obtained the consent in a very free, specific, informed manner. The challenge, though, for CBPR is that we do need that scale, right? So while it is a great tool, it's accountability-based, the take-up would be an issue that has to be looked at, because it's only where more organizations, and not to mention more economies in APEC and even globally, are parties to the framework, that the full potential of the CBPR as a system, as an accountability tool, will be able to be fulfilled.
Okay. Ken Wai, let's continue with this. CrimsonLogic was the first company in Singapore to get CBPR certification, correct? Mm-hmm. Do you believe that a global CBR environment is going to be what it takes to make this more widely adopted?
Intellectually, yes. Honestly, no.
Okay.
Okay. So why do I say that? I shared we had a closed door round table discussion yesterday, and I shared that my motivation for getting CBPR was, number one, I was curious. I wanted to figure out how difficult it was to get, because it's been around for a while, but only at that time it was 27 companies, majority in the US, 3 in Japan. How difficult it is. Number two, I had a data leak problem before, and I wanted to make sure that I was in a better position to prepare myself, not defend myself, in case Zikin comes to me and not for coffee. So, and the third is it would improve my business. Now, logically, you would think that the third would be the primary reason, but honestly, it's not, because as Royce has said, for this to happen, because CBPR is voluntary, you need to have critical mass. If you don't have the critical mass, it has no muscle. You could say that, okay, if CBPR is the best way as a certification badge to show that you comply to GDPR, that could be interesting. But when you think about removing friction for data, it's not the regulations. I think in my industry alone, I deal with trade compliance and trade flows. You would think that you can draw a PowerPoint, submit information once to Singapore export, it becomes import document into China, it comes import document to USA, super simple, easy to draw the PowerPoint. But the friction is not the regulation, the friction is in the politics, the friction is in the inconsistency in the way we design things. Customs organization has a standards for data, but Singapore is 26 mandatory fields. US needs 40. How do you make sure you have all of that? It's all those small things that need to be captured. And in a way, I'm happy for those inefficiencies, because I can bridge that.
Yeah.
Maybe I just want to just chip in here and also put the role of a CBPR in context. Because we talked about cross-border transfers of data, and how do I ensure that the recipients will be able to handle the data to the same level of security and responsibility, right? That's the fundamental principle of accountability for cross-border data flows. How do I get that assurance? You see, one thing that we mustn't forget is that a lot of, in the vast majority of cases, that, that assurance is actually obtained, right, and secured through contractual obligations. It's very convenient. It is self-help. Everyone can do it. There are so many different templates that are available. The Europeans have got some samples. ASEAN, we put our model contractual clauses. UK has got their international transfer agreements. There are many templates that are available. And I think that it is, that's going to be one mode of ensuring. When do you move away from contracts to a certification-based system like CBPR, which, to be very, very upfront and honest, requires upfront investment because you need to get the processes in place. You are engaging an external auditor, like Royce mentioned, to come in, take a look at your processes. The business model must demand this. The customers must demand this. So I would say that CBPR is one tool that will be available, right? Sitting alongside contract-based ones, including binding corporate rules, right? And also don't forget, very often, a lot of companies depend on customer consent to be another way of transferring. So there's a spectrum. CBPR is available, and I think that it's a good thing that it's there. But sorry, it's a good thing that it's there, right? But I think that we also need to be very practical. It's not going to replace everything.
Okay, so I'm gonna, full disclosure here, a big part of our digital working group next year is seized with how do we make CBPR a global standard and how do we get it adopted. I take the point, and we had this discussion around tables about contracts do the trick right now, but contracts, as the groups that I was meeting with, are usually 3 to 4 pages, 20 to 40 different points that you need to comply with, and not every contract is the same. So it gets incredibly cumbersome, particularly if you're a MISME trying to do business cross-border, which is why our interest in trying to get to these standards. The other challenge we have right now, just in the whole environment of digital trade, WTO failed to reach consensus on how to address digital trade effectively. So what does the future of digital trade governance look like in that backdrop? Yes. Because if you won't give me CBPR, then tell me how it's going to work.
I think that we shouldn't give up hope, right, in the WTO process, right? If things work through WTO, it's going to have the greatest reach and greatest impact. But again, because it's got the greatest reach and greatest impact, it moves slowly.
Yep.
And I think that a lot of the work that Singapore has been doing is around digital economy agreements, right? Or you call it digital economy agreements, DPAs, right? By whatever name. But if essentially what those agreements try to do is to put in place what are the areas of collaboration that bilaterally or multilaterally that you need to agree on to support digital trade. Now, maybe I take a step back and say that what's the difference between e-commerce and digital trade, right? So e-commerce is really when you use digital means to facilitate traditional sales. Digital trade actually will be when you are actually providing products and services digitally without having to ship goods, right? You are providing services and selling products purely online. So what are the key components that are required to ensure digital trade can go on, right? I think some of the key things that we've been putting in our DPERS, right, will be digital identity, right? How do you know who you're dealing with? Then how do you request for payments and how do you make payments, right? And then of course, data. Data flows, right? And then, of course, issues around AI and some of these other issues as well. So I think that we will see a probably proliferation of some of these things, whether it is in digital DEAs or digital trade chapters in regional trade agreements, right? But I want to just point out three things that we are seeing coming out of this, right? I'll say that, for example, there is this growing consensus that data for the purpose of doing business, right, should flow freely, and there shouldn't be a requirement of localization of processing and storage as a condition for doing business. These are clauses that are appearing in a lot of the deeper agreements in RCEP, CPTPP, right, even in the US, Mexico, Canada agreements, right? The other one is the role of data protection. Data protection is important, and then a recognition that contracts and consents are means for transferring data. And I like to highlight that the US-Mexican-Canadian agreement actually specifically says that CBPR is also a recognized means for transferring data.
Okay, he smiles every time he disagrees with me. So, Ken, what's the challenge with the proliferation of DEAs? And then, Royce, I'm going to pick your brain on how do we fix this?
Well, I think, again, anything to do with governments, it takes a long time.
Yes, and we have time. Do we have time?
So the only thing we've seen from DAs is the photographs of the signing, right? And I think you really need to get down to what's the use case he wants to push, how you demonstrate that it's really effective, and how you scale from there. And to do that, it's not easy, because it's always we can make it work if you follow my standards. But for the countries to get together, especially get two governments to get together and two bureaucrats to get together, it takes a long, long time. That's why I think that intellectually is a good, directionally is good, but I think realistically this will take 10, 20 years. In the meantime, private sector will find some way to bridge the gap.
And MSMEs are at risk. I mean, at the end of the day, those that have digitized are at a great amount of risk in terms of the digital activity that they've got underway.
I don't think so. I don't think so. Because I think it's a fallacy to think that you're a MSME and I can sell to the world. And you can do it effectively without risk. So you got to understand where you want to play, and there'll be platforms that you can go in. Alibaba is a great platform for MSMEs to come in, right? To supply goods and services. So you can't do it directly, but there are ways to get connected.
Yeah, and I guess the challenge for MSMEs that I was referring to, if you're not on a platform, it's you can't build it over and over and over again for each different market with a different set of rules.
That's true, but maybe they're not ready to grow.
Yeah. Okay.
That's a reality.
Okay. Well, I'm not joking when I say we've actually got a PowerPoint slide at the Digital Working Group that maps out USMCA, CPTPP, pick a trade agreement, and it looks at how they talk about digital trade. And they overlap, and they conflict, and they're silent, and it's just very, very complicated. Royce, you've got 5 minutes to solve this for us now. What is it going to take to create global frictionless trade?
Yeah, I think first of all, I obviously can't solve it. I think just to put it out there, right? Certainly, I don't have the locus standi. But I think in terms of throwing out some ideas and some suggestions, I think the DEA is a good start. I think I hear what Ken Wai said. But at the same time, I think the intent really is to set certain norms, right, in a very nascent, cross-cutting, amorphous, and growing area. So I think it's a good attempt, a good first attempt, which can, of course, evolve and improve along the way. I think one concrete way to improving it is in terms of, again, the scalability, right? So how can we build this network of trusted, like-minded partners to be part of this network of DEAs or DEPAs? And beyond that, or in addition to that, it's also coming up with some concrete use cases. Because sometimes I think a lot of the provisions in the DEAs, sometimes they are conflicting, like you said, across different agreements, or sometimes they may be too broad, they may be too generic. So if we can come up with use cases, for example, is it about promoting cloud computing, for example, right? Or is it about delivery of goods and services through the traditional e-commerce, but you do need the digital part to power it. And that concretizes a lot of these ideas that we have. And it also makes it easier, I hope, to get that buy-in from the different economies. Because I think, and going back again to the issue of what data is, right? And I think the choice of language is absolutely critical here. If we keep believing that data is the new oil or it's gold or what have you, then we are just encouraging policymakers to then want to hoard the data, right? Why, as a big economy, why do I need to then allow for data to flow freely? So, but if you can come up with the right language backed up by use cases as well as evidence, so that the different economies can understand why having that interoperable digital system that facilitates the exchange of ideas, that facilitates the exchange of best practices, goods and services, and policymakers will then have a much better sense in terms of why ultimately such a system, the open interoperable one, is good for its own economy. Yeah, so I think those are probably two ideas that I just want to throw out. The third one, not quite directly on point, I think is also, we also need to take a holistic approach, right? We've spoken about agreements, we've spoken about certifications at the CBPR. At the same time, I think we also need to supplement that also with some of the technology tools. It may not be a panacea, but I think it's worthy to bring technology into the equation as well, into the conversation. For example, we've spoken about PETs, right, or privacy enhancing technologies. In a way, if the promise of PETs come to pass, can we have our cake and eat it, right? Can we both protect privacy as well as allow the synthetic data or what have you to maintain largely the usability and the value out of mining of that data? And there are different promising technologies that have been being discussed, right? Another one is in terms of homomorphic encryption. How can we mine the data, derive the insights without the data even leaving my servers? So I think we do need to bring all these technologies, invest in them, have regulatory sandboxes, trial them, and see how commercially viable they are, not just in terms of the tech side, but also in terms of the business case. Right? I think collectively we can then have a much better insight in terms of what are the different moving parts and how we can collectively move forward.
Yeah. And final, just to you and Ken Y, I fully agree. I think for the MISMEs, it's going to be platform-based. It's going to be the way we're going to need to go. And I know Alibaba is doing some work on this. But I go back to the question, what is it going to take to create the right certification and trust mark environment, do you think? And is CBPR the best hope we have at this point in time? To you both, and we'll close it out with that.
Honestly, I think today, best platform will be the local data marks.
Okay.
And then you need to make sure that the countries align, well, if we can get the government to align the data marks with CBPR, and then make that jump to get the CBPR a small step, then I think that's where you have the flywheel effect. But if you start at that CBPR, I think that's harder.
Okay. And Royce, from a platform perspective, do you see that being a place Alibaba wants to play?
I think Ali is a hoarder of all the trust mark certification marks. If there's one out there, we'll be there to apply for it and get it, right? Because I do think that it's a very valuable tool that's externally validated to build the accountability and build the trust with stakeholders. But apart from that, I do think that we need to look at, like I said, adoption, and not just at the platform level, but also taking an ecosystem approach, right? In terms of the entire value chain, who are the suppliers that we have to work with, etc., and make sure that accountability extends beyond the platform and really down the entire chain. Right? I think that will truly then be able to transform the entire ecosystem. So I think the CBPR has, like I said, is very promising, but at the same time, it probably won't be the panacea. But for it to move the needle, we really need to find ways to increase the adoption. And just some ideas in terms of how we can increase adoption, in terms of getting regulatory recognition, right? In terms of even government procurement policies. I think all these different things are things we need to discuss because they are potentially able to move the needle.
Okay. I just want to say thank you very much. It's been a great panel discussion. I will share with you one of the things we do talk about at the Digital Working Group at APEC is at the starting point of any new environment like this, it's messy. And so you heard about the messiness here, and we're trying to figure out how to make it less of a messy noodle bowl. I keep using that analogy. So I just want to say thanks everyone for your time and your interest in this, and stay tuned for more about CBPR-ish stuff that we're going to try to do to move this forward. Thank you very much, gentlemen. It's a good discussion.